Sometimes insecurity appears in the smallest moments. You are about to press publish. The work is finished. But suddenly, you notice imperfections that did not bother you yesterday. A sentence feels slightly awkward. An idea feels slightly exposed. A possibility appears. What if people misunderstand me? So you edit again and again. You convince yourself you are improving quality. But something deeper is happening. You are negotiating visibility. Because once something leaves your private space, it enters interpretation. And interpretation cannot be controlled. Someone might disagree. Someone might ignore it. Someone might see right through the parts of you that feel uncertain. So the mind proposes a compromise. Just one more adjustment. But the adjustment rarely satisfies the emotional requirement. Because the real requirement is impossible. Guarantee acceptance. Guarantee safety. Guarantee validation. And because that guarantee does not exist, the work remains hidden. Invisible effort feels safe. Visible effort feels personal. And personal effort feels risky. So invisibility becomes attractive. Have you noticed how often insecurity disguises itself as rational delay? You tell yourself, I just need more clarity. I just need more preparation. I just need the right moment. But the right moment rarely announces itself. It quietly passes while you are rehearsing. Another scene, you receive a message. Someone compliments your work. Your first reaction is not pride. It is suspicion. They are just being polite. They don't really mean it. If they knew how unsure I feel, they wouldn't say that. Isn't it strange? Criticism feels believable immediately. Praise feels questionable. Your mind accepts negative evidence faster than positive evidence. Because negative feedback confirms existing identity stories. Positive feedback threatens to change them, and identity resists sudden change. Even when the change is beneficial, because change introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty activates caution. So insecurity preserves familiar self-definitions, even when they are limiting. Another ordinary moment. You are in a conversation. You want to express an opinion. But you quickly scan the room. Who agrees? Who might challenge? Who seems confident enough to defend their position? You calculate social risk unconsciously. And then you soften your statement. I might be wrong, but ... This is probably obvious, but ... Just a small thought. That single quote. Notice what happened. Before the idea even enters the world, you reduce its perceived value. Preemptive self-protection. If the idea is rejected, it does not feel like rejection of you. Because you already minimized its importance. But something else happens quietly. Others begin to perceive your contribution through the same framing. Confidence does not only influence internal experience, it shapes external interpretation. People often mirror the certainty you communicate, and insecurity subtly edits how your voice enters shared reality. Another subtle cost appears over time. When you repeatedly silence small expressions, you slowly lose access to spontaneous thinking. Ideas stop forming freely. Creativity becomes cautious. Curiosity becomes filtered. Because the mind anticipates evaluation before exploration even begins. Imagine trying to brainstorm while someone constantly interrupts with, is this good enough? Is this impressive enough? Is this original enough? Eventually, the mind prefers silence. Silence feels efficient. No risk of embarrassment. No risk of exposure. No risk of revealing incomplete thoughts. But incomplete thoughts are the raw material of insight. Perfection rarely produces originality. Messy curiosity often does. Insecurity often edits out the messy stage. And without the messy stage, authentic expression struggles to emerge. Consider how insecurity shapes memory of the past. You remember moments where you felt inadequate, moments where you felt overlooked, moments where someone seemed more confident, more articulate, more certain. But memory rarely records full context. It records emotional intensity. Perhaps you spoke more clearly than you remember. Perhaps others were not judging you as strongly as you imagine. Perhaps the room moved on quickly while your mind kept replaying the scene. Insecurity extends emotional moments far beyond their real duration. 5 seconds of awkwardness becomes 5 years of identity evidence. But most people are too busy managing their own self-image to analyze yours in detail. Your insecurity assumes an audience that is often preoccupied with their own internal narrative. Everyone is managing impressions. Everyone is negotiating visibility. Everyone is balancing authenticity with protection. Which means the social world is filled with people quietly hoping not to be exposed as uncertain. Confidence sometimes appears more widespread than it truly is. Because uncertainty is rarely displayed publicly, people display conclusions. They hide hesitation. So you compare your internal questions to someone else's external statements, which creates distorted perception. Another example, you consider trying something new, learning a skill, changing direction, starting over in some way. Your mind immediately calculates timeline. I should have started earlier. I'm already behind. I don't have the advantage others had. So the attempt feels pointless before it begins. Time becomes an argument against effort. But notice the hidden assumption that progress only matters if it is optimal. That learning only matters if it is efficient. That growth only matters if it is impressive. Insecurity often imposes unrealistic performance conditions before permission to begin is granted. If the starting point feels imperfect, motivation weakens. But every visible skill you admire once looked unimpressive. Every confident person you respect once felt uncertain privately. Competence rarely appears fully formed. It accumulates through tolerated imperfection. Insecurity demands emotional certainty before behavioral experimentation. Growth usually requires the opposite order. Behavior first, confidence later. But reversing that order feels uncomfortable. Because action produces evidence, and evidence removes imagination. Imagination protects identity. Evidence updates identity. And identity change feels destabilizing, even when beneficial. Sometimes insecurity also protects attachment. If you grow beyond familiar roles, relationships may shift. Expectations may change, dynamics may evolve. Growth introduces social unpredictability. Some people unconsciously remain smaller to preserve relational stability, to avoid outgrowing environments, to avoid disrupting group identity. Belonging feels safer than expansion. But suppressed expansion creates quiet tension. Part of you moves forward internally. Another part negotiates loyalty to previous versions of self. Internal conflict emerges. One voice says, stay consistent. Another says, stay honest. And honesty often requires change. Change sometimes requires discomfort. Discomfort triggers insecurity. So the cycle repeats. Another emotional layer appears in private moments. Late at night, when distractions reduce, when noise fades, when external roles temporarily pause, questions appear more clearly. Am I actually living in alignment with what matters to me? Or am I mostly avoiding discomfort? These questions rarely produce immediate answers, but they produce sensation, a subtle pressure, a quiet awareness that something inside you wants fuller expression, not dramatic transformation. Just slightly more honesty, slightly more participation, slightly more willingness to be seen trying. Insecurity often interrupts at precisely this threshold, because thresholds represent transition, and transition removes certainty. But something important becomes visible here. Insecurity does not always appear when you are incapable. It often appears when something meaningful becomes possible, which means insecurity can function as a signal of psychological proximity to growth. Not proof of inadequacy, but indication of importance. The intensity of hesitation often correlates with perceived significance. You rarely feel deep insecurity about trivial actions. You feel it when identity feels involved. when self-image feels exposed, when outcome feels personally meaningful, which suggests something unexpected. Insecurity sometimes highlights direction. It marks the edges of the comfort zone, the boundary between familiar self-definition and potential self-expansion. Avoiding that boundary maintains stability. Approaching that boundary creates possibility. Neither option is objectively correct, but unconscious avoidance can gradually reduce life variation, and reduced variation limits experiential learning. Learning requires interaction with uncertainty. Uncertainty produces temporary emotional discomfort, but it also produces informational richness. Information allows identity to evolve, and evolving identity allows more flexible navigation of reality, which increases long-term adaptability. But adaptability rarely feels comfortable in the moment. It often feels like temporary disorientation, temporary doubt, temporary inefficiency. Insecurity amplifies these temporary sensations and presents them as permanent conclusions. But most internal states are transitional. They change as behavior changes, which means emotional certainty is not always required before action. Sometimes emotional clarity appears after movement begins, not before, not during, after, which makes hesitation understandable, but not always necessary. The question then becomes less about eliminating insecurity and more about recognizing when it is providing useful caution and when it is exaggerating risk beyond realistic proportion. Because protection becomes limitation when it prevents meaningful participation. And meaningful participation often produces the very confidence that hesitation is waiting for, which creates a paradox. Waiting for confidence delays the experiences that produce confidence. Acting with uncertainty accelerates experiential evidence. Evidence updates expectation. Expectation influences emotional baseline. Emotional baseline influences perceived capability. And perceived capability influences future behavior. Small behavioral adjustments can gradually recalibrate internal predictions. Not instantly, not dramatically, gradually, which is often how lasting change occurs. Quietly, through repeated tolerated exposure to manageable uncertainty. Not through sudden personality transformation, but through accumulated evidence that feared outcomes are survivable. And survivability often produces increased willingness to engage again, which expands behavioral range, which increases experiential diversity, which enriches identity flexibility, which reduces fragility, which allows insecurity to exist without dictating direction. Because presence of fear does not require obedience to fear. Emotional signals provide information. They do not always require compliance. And learning to distinguish between signal and command creates psychological space. Space allows choice. Choice allows variation. Variation allows discovery. Discovery allows adjustment. Adjustment allows growth. And growth often feels subtle while it is happening, but visible when looking back, which means progress sometimes becomes recognizable only after enough moments of tolerated imperfection accumulate. Moments where you participated despite incomplete confidence. Moments where you expressed despite uncertain reception. Moments where you allowed reality to respond to your presence, instead of negotiating endlessly with imagined outcomes. Because imagined outcomes often exaggerate negative probability. Reality often contains more neutral responses than anticipated. Neutral responses provide stabilizing feedback. Stabilizing feedback reduces catastrophic expectation. Lower hesitation intensity increases willingness to attempt again, which gradually reshapes relationship with uncertainty, not eliminating insecurity, but contextualizing it, allowing it to coexist with action, instead of replacing action, which may be enough, not perfection, not fearlessness, just increased participation, slightly more visible effort, slightly less automatic avoidance. And over time, that difference compounds, quietly, but meaningfully, especially meaningfully.